Hi everyone, this is Chris Grosso with the Spiritualist.com. My guest today is Guy Newland. Guy holds a Ph.D. in the history of religions from the University of Virginia. He's worked with a great many Tibetan scholars and taught at 5 Dharma centers, all within the Dalai Lama School of Tibetan Buddhism. Since 1988, he has been a professor at Central Michigan University. His publications include The Two Truths, Appearance and Reality, Introduction to Emptiness, which are all from Snowline Publications, and, in collaboration with others, Moonshadows, Conventional Truth in Buddhist Philosophy from Oxford. Guy, thank you so very much for being here today.
Well, Chris, thanks for having me. It's a delight.
Right on, my pleasure. So, Guy has written, as I already mentioned, some great books. I want to show people here. This is a wonderful book called Appearance and Reality that I really enjoyed. This book is what really inspired me to reach out to Guy. It's called Introduction to Emptiness. It really, for me, was a great eye-opener on the subject of emptiness in Buddhism, which we'll discuss later on in the interview, as well as some other of Guy's work. So, before we get into that, Guy, I wanted to go back a bit and talk about your first introduction to Buddhism. If you could tell us around what age you were, what was it about Buddhism that drew you to it, and had you sought out any other spiritual paths prior to that, or has it always been Buddhism for you?
Okay, so I'm 58. When I was in my teenager, I guess in high school, I started getting interested in different kinds of spirituality with the idea of having an interest in something that involved experience rather than doctrine or philosophy per se at that time. So I was interested in mystical Christianity and Hinduism quite a bit. When I went to the University of Virginia, there were courses on Hinduism that I liked quite a bit. There really wasn't anything good on mystical Christianity in those days. And so I started taking classes on other kinds of things, Sufism and Buddhism, and just, seeing what kinds of things were out there. And I guess the first really serious connection I had with Buddhism was taking classes with Jeffrey Hopkins at the University of Virginia. He would about, half or a third of the time bring a Tibetan Lama into class and translate for him, and then the rest of the time he would just try to explain and make accessible for us, what we were learning about. And I think, the first thing is to really understand how important compassion is in Buddhism, and the emphasis on this sort of really deep, universal, inclusive caring, not as something that we, look to a divine being for, but as something that we try to cultivate within ourselves through a systematic program of mind training. And that was very different from things that I read before, studied before, and I've actually written a little bit about this in a book called Changing Minds, which is sort of a tribute to Jeffrey Hopkins, that I feel like I really made a personal connection to Buddhism because of his way of teaching that was like born out of his own personal experience with Buddhism, and that's what drew me in.
Great, cool. And so we're going to get into, as I already mentioned, Introduction to Emptiness was a really important book for me to read, and we're going to get into that. And something that just came up for me is I know you were saying the importance of compassion and recognizing that it's not necessarily from a divine source outside of oneself.
Yeah.
And I love that you'd mentioned, you had the interest in the mystical Christianity as well as Hinduism and things of that nature. So something that I find interesting, some Buddhist teachers won't touch reconciling this. Some are very fond of reconciling it. But in Buddhism you have, emptiness, shunyata. In Hinduism you have Brahman, which is said to be comparatively a similar thing. It's not an outside God. It's an internal, the source of all things. So before we get into actual emptiness, would you mind discussing that a little bit, since you seem to have a background in both?
Okay. Well, one thing is that I think sometimes Buddhists and Hindus exaggerate the difference between the traditions. Not everybody does, but there's a tendency on the Hindu side to worry that the Buddhists are basically nihilists, and on the Buddhist side to be very afraid that the Hindus have gone to a reifying extreme, and I think that the differences between the traditions overall, when you take each tradition as a whole, are often exaggerated. They have so much more in common, not just their basic cosmology, but a lot about their spirituality and philosophy is much, much closer together than people realize. It happens to be the case that for me, one of the things that's kept me interested in Buddhism all these years has been the sort of peculiarity of the idea of emptiness. That it's different from what you see in Hinduism or mystical Christianity, and this idea that the ultimate nature of reality is, in some sense, something that it is itself ungraspable and empty, and that it's kind of can be misleading to think of it as self-existent or a fundamental ground, and in that way, there does seem to be a philosophical difference with, say, Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism, but there, you have to recognize that there's a lot of different things within Hinduism and also a lot of different things within Buddhism.
Sure.
The particular kind of Buddhism that I'm interested in most philosophically, say in the Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Bhavaviveka, Tsongkhapa line, it tends to sort of emphasize this difference with Hinduism, that we don't really want to talk about something that's a hidden form of monism.
Sure.
We want to instead talk about emptiness as just a completely, in some sense, a completely common, ordinary fact about the world that's like occluded from us, and that it's not the ground of being. And so when you look at it that way, then you do see it's not like they all come. I don't want to say that they all come together as two ways of saying the same thing. But of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama always emphasizes that there are differences between the different religious traditions. I'm way past the idea of thinking that all the different religions in the world are all different ways of saying the same thing. They really are saying different things. But some of the most important things that they're saying for our day-to-day lives are very much the same. And that has to do with, how to cultivate a good heart, how to, be a more loving, compassionate person and be somebody who's contributing towards world peace, and minimizing, harm to people rather than being on the other side of the equation. And in that regard, religions have so much in common, much more in common than they do on these kinds of differences.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate that, and I certainly agree that there's plenty of commonalities, but you're right, they are saying separate things, and there's a lot. A lot of it does break down to semantics, but we're going to jump back into emptiness in a few minutes, and I would like to explore a little further the notion of the ground of all being and why it's not that in Buddhism. But before we get there, I don't want to jump too far ahead. I want to start with, as you mentioned, Nagarjuna, and let's talk a bit about the two truths. So, if you don't mind, I want to quickly quote something out of your book, Appearance and Reality, that I showed a minute, just to give viewers a little background before we jump into this question. So I'm going to read this real quick, and then we'll get right into it. In the book, it says that when someone comes to you seeking to understand Buddhism, where should you start? Should you elaborate on what it means to take refuge in the three jewels? Should you analyze the Four Noble Truths, taking a cue from the Buddha's first sermon? And then you mentioned Joshua Cutler, director of the Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center in Washington, New Jersey, had asked the Dalai Lama this question. And the Dalai Lama suggested that for many in the West today, the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth, is the best place to start. He argued that it is the best to lead people into the Dharma via exposure to philosophical reasoning and analysis of the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And I love that. And that's been profound for me. And that's, again, something you'll even hear in Vedanta talking about the two truths. But let's talk about it from Buddhist perspective, as that's what you teach. So can you explain for viewers in a as easily accessible way as possible this grand idea and
of the two truths?
Of the two truths, yes.
Yeah. Well, as you know from reading that passage, the Dalai Lama was sort of acknowledging the reality of the situation, that in a traditional context you would never start with the two truths. But he's sort of assuming that if you're introducing people in a culture that's not familiar with Buddhism to it, that and people have an inclination towards reasoning, that this is a much better place to start, and that if the reasoning about dependent arising and emptiness seems to make some sense to people, then they can make a connection and be drawn deeper into the tradition. That was his idea. So historically, it seems, speaking as a scholar of Buddhism, that the notion of two truths seemed to emerge out of the problem of interpreting the way that Buddha spoke about things. So sometimes Buddha would say, what do we mean by a person? When we search, the person ends up being like a chariot. When you search for the person, you don't actually find something that you can pin down and point out that is the person. And so it seems like the Buddha is sort of saying that, if you just took it out of context, that he sort of seemed to be denying the actuality or the reality of persons. But then in other places, he talks about persons as, of course, being what this is all about, trying to help people who are suffering. And he speaks of himself as a person who, did various things, such as got up from underneath the tree and went out to teach and preach in order to help other persons who were suffering. So the question is, how do you reconcile these different modes of discourse? One in which you're analyzing and deconstructing ordinary things that we sort of take as real, and one in which you're just sort of using those sort of terms which seem to be useful to make some other point. And that seems to be where this kind of discourse about the two truths started. That there's some things, and then different, as you know from Appearance and Reality, different Buddhist schools could disagree about which things, but some things that when analyzed seem to fall apart or can't be pinned down, that we can talk about them in an ordinary way, but it's not the way they really are. They're not ultimately findable in that way that they appear. And then maybe there is another category, which is the ultimate way that things are, that what you find when you say, what is this really? And you analyze it in some way, taking it apart or breaking it down with your mind analytically, and what do you come to at the end of that analysis? So some people thought, that a person is an abstraction, so to speak, a construct that's been overlaid on some underlying realities that are actually real. And those would be called dharmas, little tiny moments of experience or matter that were irreducible bits of reality, which we normally don't experience at all, right, but are actually real. And over the top of this, there's this construction of a person, which is not actually findable, that's been overlaid. And so that began to be the way people thought about, there's an ultimate way that things are that only the meditator can penetrate to. And when they do, they see that their attachment to the person is inherently real, dissolves. Mm-hmm. Okay. But then as Buddhist philosophy continued along, you had the Madhyamaka philosophy say, well, all these different categories of dharmas, of things that you think are ultimately real when you do this analysis, when you analyze closely enough, none of those hold up either. And that's where you get to the idea that it's not just the person that is, like, in some sense, a conceptual designation or a construct that's exists in relationship to something else. It's that everything is like that. Everything is like that. Even, atoms and quarks and things that seem very solid and things that seem real and things that seem really small and sort of physically irreducible, that nothing really exists in and of itself. Everything exists only in relationship to other things. And so you never get to some graspable bottom of what is like ultimately real. Because in some sense, there isn't anything that exists ultimately. All things exist conventionally. And this idea that there isn't anything at all, emptiness or Buddha or anything at all, that exists in and of itself and is therefore ultimately graspable, that is the idea of emptiness. The idea that you don't at the bottom come to some graspable thing, but you come to the ultimate truth of things is their ultimate ungraspability or emptiness of any graspable nature within them. So the idea of the two truths is that these two things, this ultimate ungraspability and yet conventional practical usability, are always right there together. It's like, to start with, you could think of it as two sides of the same coin, but then you have to realize it's really like a coin where the heads goes all the way through and the tails comes all the way through to the other side. So it's both heads and tails all the way through.
Right.
That's what it is. I mean, everything you can think of, every speck of matter, every moment of experience is fully and completely both a conventional and an ultimate reality. The difference is how you look at it. If you look at it from the point of view of what is this really, you'll only come to emptiness. If you look at it from the point of view of, well, how is this practically useful to me operating day to day, then you see a conventional nature, which is relative to your standpoint as a human rather than an ant, for example.
Right. So, relatively speaking,
they have different correct perceptions.
Right on. So, we'll get into emptiness in a second, but so just for viewers that aren't entirely familiar, the relative speaking on the day-to-day things. Like, I'm looking at my MacBook right now as I'm speaking to you. Yeah. So, in a conventional sense, here's this MacBook, but it's a form of dependent arising, because without it, the sum total of its parts, it wouldn't be a MacBook, correct?
Right.
It's empty of an inherent self.
Right. It doesn't have a self nature. Right. There isn't anything like the MacBook that can exist in and of itself. So the MacBook depends upon the existence of Apple Corporation, and then when you say, well, what is this Apple Corporation? It's the same thing. Just like the MacBook is broken into pieces, you can't really find the corporation. People used to think that the soul of the corporation or the essence of the corporation was Steve Jobs. Then Steve Jobs dies, and then Apple still goes along. The continuum flows downstream of the corporation. So, it's really hard to get used to this idea because it's so different from the way we usually think. We think of things as like are existing out there on their own side, sort of objectively. Right. But really, we are constantly ascribing or imputing or assigning or labeling them in a way that is relative to our particular perspective. There's a lot of different ways to think about this. And when I teach it in class, I try, writing a big letter up on the board. And then people have this sense that they're just passively receiving the information that the professor's written on the board. But then it's very easy to see that this is an illusion, that we've just learned to ascribe the name A in relationship to that letter, and that we're actually participating in constituting as an A. And even though it's just a convention that we've learned how to all do this together, 1, 2, 3, it's got the right shape A, and then assign that identity, then we don't even notice that we're doing it, and we experience ourselves as passive recipients of that. Right. Well, it's like that with everything. It's harder to understand like how that works with a mountain than it is with a letter, but it is the same thing. We've learned that when you see certain kinds of shapes and of certain sorts of sizes, and then it's appropriate in terms of working around in the world to identify that or label that as mountain. just like we label something else as A. And that it's like that with everything. There isn't any, like, there are things that exist out in the world, but we don't. As soon as you try to say what they, because it's not that everything's just in our mind,
Right.
but as soon as you try to say what they are and talk about them, you're only doing it in relationship to your point of view, and you're participating in constructing them as that.
Right.
And they can be legitimately constructed in very different ways from the point of view of different species. It's different, like Gary Snyder gives the example of thinking about he's playing with Dogen, actually, and thinks about, like, well, there's a certain way that a mountain goat sees a real narrow rocky ledge on the side of a cliff, and there's a very different way that I see it. I see it as like something that is like right before I die,
Right.
Whereas the goat sees it as like a place that it can be safe, like a resting place. It's home from it's a refuge from a predator. And that in that way, you're sort of like, well, you're seeing sort of the same thing, but it means something completely different. But if you take spiders and other, bats and animals that have different sense powers than ours, you can see that they legitimately, correctly, adaptively experience the world in the same place, in the same time, radically different ways. And that is an indication that although there is a world, it isn't objectively set up as having certain content except relative to the different kinds of perceivers. And that's the hardest thing to get. People can start by understanding that, like, office buildings didn't just spontaneously appear, that they depended upon causes and conditions,
Right.
and they also depend on parts, right? And the harder thing to get used to is that there's a subtle way in which everything also depends upon being labeled or designated in order to be that. I mean, there's something that's there, but it only becomes correct to designate it as, a telephone relative to the perspective of a human, who knows how to use a telephone. And for the spider, it's actually not a telephone. Right? It's
right.
Not, it's there's something there that's in the way, but it's not actually a telephone.
Right.
And so the telephone, it seems to me to be like objectively a telephone from its own side, but that really isn't the case. It's a telephone correctly in an interrelated, dependent way with me, with us.
Right.
So when we think about it, it just like looks to me like, oh, it's a telephone just from its own side, naturally appearing, because it must have some kind of telephone nature over there. That's wrong. That's the idea is that's how we get led astray.
Right. Okay, so that, I think that covers the relative side very well, and then it gives us a look into that. And now when we go to the other side of the same coin, that's
emptiness,
right, that's intertwining with both sides. So you said before, according to Buddhism, we're not talking about the ground of all being, and if I heard you correctly, and you look at things like physics. I'm no physicist, but a very lay person can understand that you go down to the subatomic particles and quarks, and in them is an energy. It's not a material, but there's an energy. And so we have the unified field theory and the Planck scale and things of that nature. So in string theory, right. So if you could talk a bit about the way Buddhism sees emptiness versus more traditional like physics, or Vedanta, like I've mentioned again, they'll say Brahman. I think it's more in line with what physics is saying today. So if you can chat about that a little bit.
Well, I like to be really careful about making comparisons between, quantum mechanics and physics and Buddhist philosophy.
Sure.
I don't. Sometimes, people can be jump too quickly to conclusions about these things. But I know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is not dismissive of these comparisons. He's alluded to some of these things himself in terms of the observer participation problem, the measurement problem.
Right.
When you always somehow get entangled with things when you're trying to make these measurements, and you can't you can't figure out what they are objectively on their own side apart from your participation in the process of making the measurement. And without saying that that's the same thing as what I'm trying to describe in Buddhist philosophy, it could be that it's pointing at a similar kind of thing, or that that it could be convergent with the kind of thing that I'm talking about. That Newtonian physics tends to operate from the idea that they're objectively real objects that have certain properties in and of themselves. Whereas when we've started analyzing at the quantum level, that's become problematized even within science. And this has caused people a lot of consternation. You have these quantum mechanics equations that correctly predict what's going to happen, but people don't have, and you can use them in a lab. But what people don't have is any good way to conceptualize what the world is like, or make a picture in their mind of what a world is like in which these kinds of things can be true. How can something be both a wave and a particle, right? How can it be that things aren't in any particular place until we look at them? That the cat is in a suspended state between alive and dead until we open the box. This is just like very, very hard to figure out, like how to put it into our brain, the way our brains are used to making sense out of the world, back from Neolithic times and before. Right. It just does not fit together. So it could be that there are certain limits to what the human mind is able to model, to represent internally. And it could be that in different ways, that physics, approaching things from the scientific side, has pushed its analysis of how things exist to the point where it's come up against these same kind of limitations, or parallel kinds of limitations to the ones that religions have been talking about when they say that it's something that we will talk about, but the Tao that can be spoken about is not the true Tao, and so forth. You have that kind of statement in every tradition, and it's possible that there's some overlap. That when you start thinking about the ultimate, you come up against ineffability, undescribability, paradox, apparent contradiction, and people try to come up with the best way to think about it they can, make things work, but that they kind of all agree that it doesn't fit into our heads. The actual way that reality is, the closer you look at it, the less well it actually can be modeled within our brains.
Right.
I think this is true in Buddhism. I mean, from reading my books that Tsongkhapa and the whole Gelugpa order really emphasizes that it's necessary and possible to get a real clear conceptual picture of these things. But this is a stepping stone to having a direct experience of reality that is actually not expressible in the way it actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, a Gelugpa Lama, who was a great scholar, told me, he said, well, when you see things as they are, you don't need to read any more books. And it's like, and that's like the most bookish, tradition that there is. It includes a famous quote that's in the book you were just reading, where one of the Kadamba Lamas says, some people like to brag that they've only read one little book, and other people are ashamed of it. But it doesn't matter, because they'll never become fully awake until they've read a whole yak's load of books, right? So it's true, you have to open your mind up to a lot of these different ideas, and it does help to think about things. But if you think that ultimately you will be able to think your way into making a perfect model of reality in your mind, that you can conceptually understand things just as they are, then ultimately it falls short.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you for explaining that. I definitely appreciate it. So, someone who's listening right now, and I mean, I'm sure you've heard this, a lot of it's just an unfortunate stigma attached to Buddhism from a lot of people that don't actually understand it. Is, you hear these teachings on emptiness and dependent arising, and a lot of people will look at it and say, well, it's very nihilistic. It's a very bleak kind of teaching, and I think those that understand it recognize the significance that it's actually helping an individual to lessen that grasping for the material, and there's a lot of peace in this teaching. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the benefits, the benefits of understanding emptiness and Buddhism and our selfless nature.
Well, of course, the idea is here that we suffer unnecessarily because we don't see things the way they are. So we tend to see them as being out there, and then we can grasp hold of them, and then we'll be happier when we get a hold of a better telephone or a better car or a better house. And the problem is that things don't really have a graspable nature. They're continuously changing and disintegrating, and they exist only in relationship to other things. So they don't really. It occurred to me, when I was thinking about these things, that if there really were objectively real, graspable things which we could get hold of and thereby find peace and contentment and happiness, then Buddha was like the worst teacher ever, because he's misled people into not getting what will actually make them happy. But you see so many people around the world, and the story of Siddhartha's life is a classic story. You can have everything materially and then be just as miserable.
Yeah.
And so grasping onto things doesn't seem to work as a path to peace. And then you can have the same thing about grasping onto special experiences, right? As Trungpa Rinpoche pointed out, we can become grasping about having special experiences too.
Sure.
So that's one thing, is that we find a kind of a peace that's like by being more in accord with reality, seeing things as they are, not thinking that by grasping hold of them we can sort of magically make ourselves happy. But it's not just about our own liberation from that cycle.
Right.
It's also about helping other people, helping others. We in the Mahayana tradition, we especially emphasize the idea that from the very beginning you should be motivated by trying to include as many beings as possible in your motivation for doing your practice. And there's a lot of ways in which it becomes possible to include more beings, because you don't see it as like an addition of an infinite number of objectively real beings. That is, all of these beings exist interdependently. None of them exist in and of themselves. And there isn't any like fixed limitation. Like I feel maybe that there's only so many people that I can take care of. And maybe that's true at this particular moment, right? But there's all different kinds of ways in which beings can change to be able to do much more than they're able to now. We don't have a fixed nature because we're empty. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's possible for us to change into beings who can help many more people much more effectively than what we're able to do now. I'm telling you that's a way that emptiness has to do not just with freeing ourselves from cycles of dissatisfaction based on an unrealistic view of the world, but it also sort of liberates us to include other beings that, sort of not have self-imposed a priori limitations about what we're capable of doing in terms of helping others. I think it helps people with compassion fatigue, to meditate on emptiness and dissolve everything into emptiness for a while and then rise back in and include everybody.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you so much, Guy. The last couple of questions I have, we've gotten into some pretty heavy stuff, so I wanted to end on a little bit of a lighter note for viewers and talk first my last two, and let's talk about some books. Here you are, this Buddhist scholar. What are some things who are some authors? What are some books that you appreciate? They can be Buddhist, but is there anything outside of Buddhism, even outside of spirituality, any books, authors, or I know you were saying before the example of I read one book and I've got it all. It's all good. So,
Yeah. No,
what?
it's like the idea there of yogis who have a kind of anti-intellectualist streak, and so there can be a certain pride about having only
Right.
one book, right? No, yeah, I'll tell you a few books, and these are books that I connect to, spiritually as a person, separate from anything that's within my realm of knowledge as a particular scholar.
Hmm.
Three of my favorite books. One is Zen Master Raven by Robert Aiken Roshi. This is Robert Aiken Roshi. People know as like a Zen teacher who was in Maui, lived in Maui, and taught for many years. And he wrote so many different books that were really beautiful introductions and explanations of Zen practice. And then before he died, he wrote one last book, which is very strange and seems to be just a collection, sort of like Zen Jataka stories. They're all these little animal stories.
Huh.
And people haven't really given it as much attention as it deserves. This is like, it's sort of like a spiritual biography. He's telling the story of his own life, possibly through these animal characters. And it's like, or you could take it as a 20th century American koan collection. It really is that in some sense. And this is a book that, I don't come from a basis in Zen practice, but it's really what I've found is by understanding Buddhist philosophy, I can look at these stories and often I can, understand what's going on at a conceptual level, right? Because they're playing with the same pieces, the two truths and so forth. And so that's one book I really like. Another book which I think might have already alluded to is Gary Snyder's book, Practice of the Wild. Of course, Gary Snyder is a great American Buddhist poet, Pulitzer Prize winner, but he's not as well known for this book of essays, Practice of the Wild, in which he really, explains his way of being a Buddhist, which is like intentionally and very thoroughly grounded in Turtle Island, in being a person of this continent and of this place and this time, not trying to be, a Tibetan Buddhist or, a Japanese Buddhist in America, but like Snyder's our ancestor in terms of really trying to figure out what it means to be an American Buddhist, and his fullest expression of this, in terms especially the connections with ecology, is in Practice of the Wild. And one of my very favorite books in the whole world is Zhuangzi, the Taoist author. His writings are usually just self-titled, Zhuangzi, and Zhuangzi has so many ideas that overlap with Buddhist philosophy. I don't want to say that it's exactly the same,
Right.
but it has so much compatibility with Buddhist philosophy, and it's not elaborated in a systematic way. It's more, like a series of stories and dialogues. So it's a kind of in the mode of inquiry rather in the mode of systematic exposition. But what's great about it is he hits many of the same themes that you find in Buddhist tradition, but it's constantly infused with a kind of comic, poetic, open-ended spirit, rather than in the mode of let's kind of logically present a pre-existing system. And I find it enormously liberating to read Zhuangzi, and I have over decades. I taught it again this semester, and it's these three books that I mentioned. They're not necessarily the easiest things to read, but they're not scholarly works. They're accessible. They reward rereading.
Right.
Of all three have fallen apart.
Wow.
Yeah, because when you read them again, you keep seeing things that you didn't quite get before.
Sure. Well, thanks for sharing those. And the last question, I was jazzed to see this because we're friends over on the Facebook there, and I was checking out your profile, and I always like to see whether people like musically. And I was psyched
Recently updated in terms of that, but yeah.
Well, I loved. I mean, so I saw. We had Hendrix, we had Radiohead, the
Yeah.
Pixies, Sonic Youth, who I love.
Sonic Youth, so great.
Yeah, so I'm like, wow, all right, great. He's not only a brilliant, teacher of Buddhism, but he's also got some great taste in music. So, similar to the author book question, what are some of your favorite bands or albums, and a little bit of the why behind that?
Yeah. Well, I think I think I really like art in general. Like I was thinking, it's not really limited to music. I like great films. I like great paintings and sculptures. I like opera. I like classical music, and I like certain kinds of rock music really a great deal. I've gone to Pitchfork Music Festival in Chicago 3 years in a row, and this will be my 4th year in a row. And I'm pretty much the oldest person there, which is interesting. Yeah, I like TV on the Radio. Yeah. It's a really good band. I don't know. I think maybe one element of it is that I have no talent in this area myself, and so I'm kind of like a little bit in awe of these people who can do things with violins and with their voices that are so beautiful.
Yeah.
But it's like all over the world, religions include music, for example.
Yeah.
Confucius was very explicit in saying that music is part of moral education. It helps us know ourselves better by seeing what kinds of feelings arise in us, and the way we're moved by seeing, say, in this museum in Sarnath, they have a fantastically luminous, beautiful statue of Shakyamuni Buddha, and it just, it affects people. Mm-hmm. And the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, they have a Guanyin statue, and when you look at it, it just, I don't know, it moves something in you that's different from reading a book where people are talking about compassion.
Sure.
And it's not just Buddhist art, but I saw Michelangelo's David, and I never understood why people like that in pictures.
Yeah.
But when you actually go to see it, you're saying, oh,
yeah,
it just really does something. It creates an experience, and this art has this ability to move us and to touch us in different ways, and it gets you in touch with a totally different part of yourself, or in my case, a different part of myself. I tend to be intellectual, rational, logical, trying to make sense of the world, put things together, and then art is opening up the other side of my brain for a little bit of exercise as well. Yeah. And it's in so many different ways. It can be emotionally, obviously, but I was thinking of when I went to Barcelona a couple of years ago, and I saw, Miro. My mind got blown open by Miro, and they have this crazy guy, Gaudi, who has all this amazing cathedral there and all this strange sculpture. It's just so amazing. Mm-hmm. But one of the weirdest things that I saw that I can't get out of my mind was a piece of conceptual art over in the Reval area by the Museum of Contemporary Art. There's this empty church that's been desanctified. It's totally empty. And it has a sign out front that says Contemporary Art Exhibition. You go in and there's nothing there, but then you hear these weird crackling sounds. You can't see where they're coming from. So you walk up to the front, and over on the side up in the front, there's a plastic water bottle like this one. And it's got a suitcase leaning on it, like a roller bag from somebody a tourist would use on an airplane or a business person. And the roller bag is leaning on the bottle and slowly crushing it. So it's making this kind of sound. And the sound is being picked up by all these mics and reverberating through the empty church. Wow. And I'm just looking at this and I'm going, oh my God, this is this whole church is dedicated to this exhibition about, and I'm like, this, at first I was I felt like I'd sort of been taken. And then I felt like I came to Barcelona to see their art, and I feel like this piece of art is pointing right back at me and saying, pointing back at my own nature as the art tourist. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, it's beautiful.
And that was that was different from seeing a Guanyin. It's like a totally different way that art can open up your mind. So yeah, I love really good rock music. I mean, Hendrix is an inconceivably fantastic artist, but it's not just that. There's so many different kinds of ways in which art connects to us on a different level than just logically analyzing things.
Yeah. I love what you said about the art. I was in, I've had plenty of experiences around as well. And for me, I can't do art. I'm a musician, but I have no artistic talent. So I'm like you with music. I'm like, whoa. And I was in Rome in 2005. And I'm not a fan of Catholicism personally, to each their own, but it's not my cup of tea. But I did the Vatican, and I will tell you, I was touched, especially when I went into the Sistine Chapel and just being there. It was a very surreal, beautiful experience, and it really touched my heart. And so I love that you brought up art, and it's not just specifically music. I mean, all mediums of art, which would be the umbrella of film and whatnot. It's all
the thing is with people like Sonic Youth and is a good example because this is a particular subset of this issue of just really connecting with some kind of emotion and intensity in the music. That's what I feel like is like, I don't know, Brad Warner has this thing and some of the other, Noah Levine, I guess, too, about, punk being a kind of like way of deconstructing sort of artificial respect for things in the world, and that the only thing that punk doesn't punk is punk itself, and go to the Heart Sutra, right? That's Brad Warner, and there's something to that. That there's like a kind of not wanting to just accept the world as it's been handed to us attitude, being willing to break things open and question what we're told about how things are. And I think that, the connection I would make to Buddhism about that is that, essentially what I've been trying to say is that we take things at face value. They appear to us as independently and objectively real, and we're wrong. We're wrong, all the time about that. And so it's not that these things don't exist, but they really don't exist at all the way they appear to us. And so that kind of like, what do you say, challenging the apparently given status quo, I guess, is the connection. Sort of, you could say Rage Against the Machine. I mean, that's not one of my bands, but it's like, it's like that. There has to be a ferocious intensity of the Bodhisattva's wisdom that like breaks through the theory of cyclic existence as like the world as it's given to us and we're supposed to believe in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I also grew up punk hardcore. It did that for me, and I love seeing increasing amounts of 30-somethings, 40-somethings that grew up in the punk hardcore scene sitting in sanghas and meditation. It's like it was a natural progression for many people. They were looking for that authenticity in their teenage years, and they found it later in Buddhism or elsewhere, but I see a lot of it in Buddhism, so that's great. So good comparison. So, guys, the last thing before we wrap this up is if you could let people know where they can find your books online, and I also wanted to ask, are you working on anything new, or what are you up to these days?
Of course, there's all the regular mega bookseller places that you can find my books. Snowline, which published a lot of my books, has been absorbed into Shambhala Publishing now. So their website is a place to find my things nowadays. I guess they still have a Snowline imprint within Shambhala, and I have the newest thing that will probably come out. You mentioned you read at the beginning this book Moonshadows is like a collaboration with a bunch of philosophers. And even though I'm not officially trained as a philosopher, they let me be in the club. Nice. And that we call the club the Cowherds. And so we did this book that's kind of trying to take Buddhism seriously as philosophy, like doing it from within the vocabulary and the culture of Western philosophy, but taking the Buddhist philosophy seriously and engaging it on that level. And this book is part of that project, but we have another one coming out that's in the same vein. So that is the next thing that will probably come out for me. There's a number of other things that I'm working on, but frankly, I'm in a little bit of a stall professionally right now because of my wife died in November, and that's kind of like made it so that my brain is not is only gradually reacquiring the ability to focus enough to do scholarship.
Sure.
But
sure.
I'm getting there, but it's not quite all the way there yet.
Well, I did not know that. My condolences.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to hear that. But I want to say thank you for your work. As I told you personally, it's been a tremendous help in my path. And as you shared before the call, that other stranger who happened to call you and tell you how great it was. So it's
Yeah.
it's wonderful that you're putting this out there in the world. So
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad that people who write books. This is something that I learned. A lot of people, some people maybe if you write the Harry Potter books, then you don't need anybody else to tell you that your work is being read and appreciated. But a lot of people, like for example Gary Snyder, when I found his books to be really valuable, I found his email and wrote him fan mail,
yeah,
and also asked him some questions, and he wrote me back. And a lot of people are not so famous that they don't answer their emails, and it is helpful for me to, because we do this work alone.
yeah, oh yeah.
It's helpful to see that there actually are people who are benefiting from it, and that gives us more encouragement to keep doing it.
Yeah, I understand completely. So the encouragement's here, my friend. We appreciate your work. I will continue
Thanks, Chris.
Oh, for sure. I'll continue to spread the good word. And Gary, thanks. Or Guy, I'm thinking of Gary you just mentioned. Guy, thank you so much for your time. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, well, it's been great. Yeah, I'm delighted to meet you.
Cool.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Okay.
All right. So, well, thank you for your time. And I'll have a link up on the page and where people can find your work over at Shambhala. And thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.